shall we? Okay, welcome back. Let's start our second session, the afternoon session of day one. Our first speaker is Paris Lavidis. Paris holds a master's degree from the EGS, the European Graduate School, and is currently a PhD student candidate at the University of Ljubljana, the Department of Philosophy, writing a thesis on Hegel and Lacan. He's also been, I'm not sure what your plans are for the future, but he's also been a visiting researcher at Newcastle, working closely with Newcastle PhD philosophy students. In his thesis, Paris is working on, it's difficult to understand so many things, but I would say you have a specific focus on the theory of discourses, but also a specific interest in questions surrounding formalization and mathematization in psychoanalysis. The title of Paris's presentation today is La formalisation vraie et la fausse, the true and false formalization from Freud's Matheme to Lacan's Mytheme. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorenzo, for the introduction and for inviting me along with Tade, and thank you all for being here. So, la formalisation vraie et la fausse, of course, is a joke on an écrit that Lacan wrote in 1958, I believe, La Psychoanalysis vraie et la fausse, which is all about the relationship between psychoanalysis and logos, just as background. I'm going to begin by reading the passage that I would nominate as the epigraph of our conference on philosophy and psychoanalysis. Everything that gives weight to the discourse of metaphysics always rests on some ambiguity. Put another way, if all of the terms with which you serve yourself when you do metaphysics were strictly defined, each having only one signification, if the vocabulary of philosophy were triumphant, the eternal goal of the professors, then you wouldn't have any more to say. You would notice that mathematics is much better. There you can use signs with an unequivocal sense because they don't have any. The above passage cited from Lacan's 8th seminar, specifically the lesson on agalma in the middle of his analysis of the Symposium, seems like one of those passages which a philosopher must simply ignore in order to deal with psychoanalysis. But if one were to simply ignore such passages, dare say I, permit me saying we philosophers wouldn't be here today. So I invite you to consider that not only is this sensible as a statement for a philosopher working with psychoanalysis, but it is also perhaps the most sensible of statements about metaphysics and ultimately mathematics. But it is only sensible if one considers on which ambiguity it is that metaphysics always rests. And frankly, in this passage, Lacan is simply not quite as unequivocal as would be required. The ambiguity at the origin of metaphysics is not the lack of strict definition of univocal signification of any of its terms, being the one, God, you name which, but rather a permanent ambiguity of the vocabulary of philosophy, indeed, that of all us human animals to the extent that we are speaking beings. But it's really only in a passage from Lacan's 10th seminar, hidden in the lesson on a lack irreducible to the signifier, that we receive an answer regarding on which ambiguity it is that metaphysics always rests. The relation to lack, manque, is foundational to all logic to such an extent that one could say that the history of logic is that of its successes, réussites, in masking it, by which it is tantamount to a big bungled act, un vaste acte manqué, if you give to this term its positive sense. That's indeed why you always see me return by some path or other to these paradoxes of logic which are destined to suggest to you the doorways through which and the paths by which is imposed on us the certain style that permits us achieving, réussir, this bungled act, i.e. not bungling lack, de ne pas manquer le manque. I promise that I'm not here today to perform a word-by-word exegesis of every passage I evoke, and on the contrary, I promise to avoid it. But I must remark that the passage above is quite revealing if one is to truly read it. Logic's successes, réussite in masking lack, manque, render it tantamount to an acte manqué, crucially, giving this term its positive sense, while psychoanalysis achieving, réussir, this bungled act permitted de ne pas manquer le manque. If you are asking me, I'd say this implies that logic certainly looks at one style of lack, indeed lack is foundational to logic, but masks or misses another style of lack, namely a lack irreducible to the signifier, but equally constitutive of it, i.e. a real lack, but not at all a lack in the real. First things first, what is a symbolic lack? Generally speaking, let's say, it's the lack of something, or yet more precisely, the lack as something. Or, since the symbolic is a system of presences and absences, it's defined early in Lacan, and it's indeed foundational to the early Lacan, as presence in absence and absence in presence. Or, to the extent that it is always hidden in our language under the guise of copulation, it's when X is not, to the same extent that X is not. And moreover, per an apologue, which Lacan claims is unfounded to situate this lack, it's what permits that, for example, a book is missing Monk in its place. On the contrary, what is real lack? Well, if the real is what lacks nothing, not some nothing, but lacks nothing, period, then it's not a book or even the lack of a book, but the unmarked pages missing in the book really lacking. A real lack is not some deeper lack, but in some respect a shallower lack, and it's not even certain that if it's not a lack of something, nor of some nothing, it's a lack at all. It would not be a lack indeed if not for the fact that simply there is a real lack of the case in which the real would be full. For this case really lacks. It's not that it's empty or that it's full of emptiness or the likes, but rather that it lacks fullness with no more one can say of it. And thus fullness is not, purely and simply. Now, by definition, it's very difficult to speak of this real lack since it is irreducible to the signifier. But nonetheless, I believe I'm in a position to obtain a conjecture. Symbolic lack is the ambiguity on which metaphysics always rests, and ultimately the history of logic, in its abusive cohabitation with metaphysics, is indeed summable as a parade of malentendus of the lack irreducible to all of that symbolic lack, yet almost inescapably reduced to it. But of course, this difficulty is not the fault of metaphysics, since it's invariant in our thought to the extent that it is so in our language. I'm not joking about this history of logic and its defaulting on symbolic lack. Thanks to a reference that Moritz gave me the other day, it all started with Plato, or better, it started with the first Neanderthal idiots, but it all started getting articulated with Plato. Indeed, it all started arguably with the Parmenides, which in the final analysis, and moreover in its final sentence, is not about being or the one, but rather lack. If the one is not, then nothing is, which we'll return to as a formulation, on the one hand, and if the one is not, then nothing is. Indeed, there was a reason I mentioned the lesson title from which I drew the first passage, namely about Plato. And it all finishes to some extent with Hegel, but not by achieving the eternal goal of the professors, for sure. But the backdrop, l'arrière-plan, for Plato is a bit simpler than ours at the moment. Parmenides, a few years before, began the history of metaphysics with the statement that what is, and what is not, or, not equivalent but corollary, that being is, and nothing is not. Let's call it imaginary lack, since in effect it lacks nothing, but with no symbolic lack at one's disposal to perform a kind of cratio ex nihilo, then this nothing is not something. Being is full and nothing is empty. Heraclitus, by positing everything becoming, is not any different, since everything becoming is equally nothing not becoming. No less imaginary, since precisely it masks lack in full, and thus no less lacking. Thus, and this is the reference that Moritz gave me, in The Sophist, which is a wonderful dialogue, Plato's intervention is purely to understand the function of symbolic lack as one inevitability of language. Per the visitor, speech supposes, or hypothestai, literally hypothesizes, supposes what is not to be. And thus, per Theaetetus in his response, great sentence, speech carries the greatest of aporia, telos kun aporias o logon echoi. And crucially, the visitor derides each cosmological proto-philosophical account of what is and what is not, i.e. metaphysics, as telling a myth, a mython, and one could add, a myth about lack. Ultimately, the problem is resolved in the dialogue with the conclusion that, indeed, we can name things that aren't, an insight that carries over 2,000 years to Hegel, again, who radicalizes the conclusion by suggesting precisely that a name is the lack of the thing. Voila, the symbolic lack. And it's not for nothing that one follows this thread to the point of affirming the reductio ad absurdum of Plato's Parmenides. If what is not is, symbolically, i.e. if the one is not, isn't it that the nothing is, really? This is the presupposition that we're going to critique. I'm going to abridge this a little bit, but in effect, between Aristotle and Kant, it's all a matter of whether we can pose existence or non-existence on the negation of the copula versus the predicate. And even with Hegel, who makes things difficult by suggesting in some passages, if one's close reading, that you cannot copulate over being, before Heidegger ever said that, nonetheless, he says very patently in the second paragraph of the Logic that das Nichts ist nichts, So the nothing is nothing. And thus their unity is becoming, or moreover, existence, Dasein, which per Hegel, and like the book on the bookshelf of Lacan's apologue, is tantamount to being in a place, an einem Ortsein, and so forth. And ultimately, these issues, of course, go through Heidegger, who will not say anything, will not copulate over being. Of course, es gibt sein is his preferred method of going about it. But nonetheless, when he famously pronounces to the quizzical response of someone like Carnap that das Nichts nicht it, he's nonetheless finding a way of creating a verb that would be sufficient to nothing, but nonetheless tantamount to saying being is, just in the negative. So I will abstain from continuing, but let it suffice to say that for some reason, which I will proffer, it took psychoanalysis from Freud to Lacan in order to get to the point of making the two statements with which I began. It is not simply that nobody considers lack, but that, all in all, language serves as an obstacle to its real status, and speech no better, regardless of how well one defines one's terms. And so let me diagnose the barrier to the history of metaphysics as the assumption of the following. If symbolic lack is involved to the extent that what is not is, then real lack is involved to the extent that, precisely, the nothing is foreclosed or privated. But, au contraire, the supposition of the real by the symbolic is that the nothing is. So this is the ambiguity we're dealing with, that on the one hand, the supposition of the symbolic, of the real by the symbolic is that the nothing is, but precisely the real is the opposite in its lacking quality, that it's foreclosed or privated that the nothing is, and I'll qualify that. So are we barred from any success in approaching this lack irreducible to the signifier? In spite of Lacan's prejudices against philosophy, or perhaps thanks to them, one can say confidently no. Metaphysics may be ambiguous, but through what we will discover as a formalized writing, metapsychology is not, and indeed, logic may be the source of it, but only to the extent that it is not bound to mathematics, but to logos. Indeed, if the professors were to achieve their eternal goal, per Lacan, then there'd be nothing more to say, since precisely there'd be no real lack, or, since my speech is just as ambiguous as anyone else's, there'd be, qua symbolic, no real lack. But it is our whoredom for sense, our will to slide from one lack to another, a side effect of our species being, if I may, in the final analysis, that prevents this eternal goal, eternal as it is, from being achieved, and thus we must choose whether to do philosophy and keep speaking, or, with psychoanalysis, to do what I might dare call true philosophy and start writing. Now, Lacan is known for many things, some myths, some aren't, but if there is one thing he is known for, it is accomplishing a return to Freud in two senses. A return to Freud's logos, a return to the letter of his texts, and a return to Freud as a return to logos as such, which is a return to the spirit of his texts indeed. All in all, Lacan is known for introducing the function and field of speech and language and structure and discourse, and all in all, the symbolic in psychoanalysis. And for some psychoanalysts, speech and language and the likes are just as much as one needs to know about Lacan. Nonetheless, logos harbors a similarly profound ambiguity to the point that to conceive of Lacan's return to Freud as one to logos is, on the contrary, to misconceive of it. To conceive of it properly is not at all on the basis of the break between the Lacan of the symbolic and the other Lacan, the Lacan of the real, but on the basis of the following. Indeed, if there is any value in, one could say, a theory of one's development, then the development of Lacan's theory demonstrates that logos is an utter misnomer, since it is more and more evident that Lacan's return to Freud will have been, so to speak, to his logic. And if the distinction between logos and logic is not apparent in the first instance to anyone, this is thanks to the fact that simply it was not apparent to him. Indeed, and I'll abridge this slightly, it goes a bit into what mathematics and formalization does, which is different from logos, but I think that when you compare two very nice passages, one in which Lacan first refers to meta-language and another one, that's in Seminar 3 and then in Seminar 5, where he first says there is no meta-language, you can see what's at stake in the trickiness of the relationship between mathematics and language. To put it very simply, obviously it's coextensive with it, and on the other hand, it is utterly distinct from it, especially with regards to its medium. And ultimately, if Lacan in Seminar 17, even then, questions the discourse of mathematics to the extent that in it A equals A, i.e. the signifier A contains itself, this is easily answered by observing that, first of all, mathematics is not a discourse, and two, A is not a signifier, but a letter, a pure signifier, so to speak, and Lacan observes this himself. And the next course of development of his was indeed to try to demonstrate this. And to be as clear as possible, it is not that writing suffices without language. Lacan makes this point quite clear from the overture to Seminar 1 all the way through to the crucial 10th lesson of Seminar 20, when he first introduces knots, but simply that it transmits where language fails due to the obstacle of sense. We are thus in a position to reread Lacan's rereading of Freud. Any example that is apparently logosical, dreams, slips, jokes, symptoms, fantasies, traumas, etc., is actually in the final analysis logical, as demonstrated by his reinterpretations of the Oedipus complex, the myth of Totementu, and so forth. Moreover, for example, Lacan's combinations of pronouns from Seminar 3, which are indeed like mathematical exercises, or the nice ambiguity in French, récréation mathématique, recreations, or even consequentially, his permutations of negation from Seminar 6 are just as heuristic as his apologue of the library, and both are ultimately revised logically, namely in the 9th seminar, but we'll get to that. The way I would describe this process, following the ex post facto thread from the later Lacan, is that of searching for what I call a Freudian Mytheme, which, like the philosophers that the visitor in Plato's Sophist refers to, attempts to approach, let's say, the entry of the signifier in the real, hence through logos, which is always a point of fuzziness as far as language and ultimately the origin of language is concerned. But finding in this Mytheme what he calls a Matheme. Put quite simply, Freud to Lacan from the Mytheme to the Matheme. Nonetheless, all of the above was necessary in order to formulate my main thesis. There is one, and all in all, only one time that the process goes in the other direction, from a Freudian Matheme to a Lacanian Mytheme, namely in the first half or so of Seminar 7 during Lacan's rereading of the Entwurf and isolation of das Ding, which is quite notably defined as the thing, but in one instance as the no thing, or the pas chose. Now, when Lacan reads the text in Seminar 2, he's doing something actually quite clever, simultaneously taking what one could see as a mathematization/formalism on the part of Freud, and as revising Freudian energetics, and as reinterpreting that mathematization formalism along the lines of thermodynamics, which renders it close to a mathematical formalization, but with some very important distinctions. But when Lacan reads the text in Seminar 7, he manages to find the one Mytheme which Freud is typically full of, or, since, quote, the thing is what of the primordial real suffers, pâtit, the signifier, the one pathème, as Jacques Lemaitre calls it, or, to appropriate a term contextless for reasons that I hope I will soon make clear, the one poème, per Badiou. And I would dare say, does metaphysics with this Mytheme, with all of its ambiguity. But what is clear is that the ontology sketched in this seminar is one in which what is not symbolically is, and beyond, in which the nothing really is. At best, a supposition of a transposition of symbolic lack on the real. The conclusion? If Miller says that Seminar 7, when he discusses this in his own seminar in 1972-3, during the process of establishing its publication, that this seminar occupies a place apart, since it is a pathetic seminar to the extent that there are but few of Lacan's that are so unmathematical, and it's the one where the other Lacan truly begins, since, de jure, it's the first seminar about the real, I must object, especially this last point. In its consideration of Das Ding, at least, Seminar 7 is not at all about the real, de facto, but rather an imaginary real projected by the symbolic. The other side of this is that Seminar 9, by contrast, systematizes the Matheme par excellence of Freud, namely Der einzige Zug, first isolated but with hardly any result in Seminar 5, and Lacan sketches an unambiguous, and possibly with respect to Seminar 7, contradictory ontology through mathematical logic, which, per Seminar 16, is logic tout court, that not only informs Lacan later, but quite literally constitutes the later Lacan. Though it would take many steps to demonstrate all of this, the task at hand is simply to illustrate it. Before beginning any serious formalization, I want to make a precise intervention on the topic before beginning. The passage from Seminar 8 quoted at the beginning, as discussed, was from the lesson on agalma. The reason that Lacan is talking about the issue of metaphysics is not simply because he's reading Plato, but also because he is reading, in philosophy, Plato's agalma. Again, a far cry from a brute slap in the face against metaphysics, the point is quite incisive. What makes the discourse of metaphysics weighty, and especially around the question of the subject, is that there is always something that is beyond, or behind, or beneath the, call it non-conceptual in the concept. Or, put another way, there is always the other side of knowledge. For every endroit, there is an envers. In short, this is not the objet A in the subject, but in effect the fetish, or the veiled nothing, or simply the nothing, which comes in the discussion of the fetish and also discussion of objet in Seminar 4 and 10, respectively, that is only positivized to the extent that it is precisely fetishized. And ultimately, that there be some agalma, a positivized real negativity beyond what is simply symbolically positive qua negative, is, from the perspective of the real, an utter untenability, an imaginary real, hence what I'd call the fundamental problem of metaphysics. This ambiguity is effectively there in Lacan's most famous discussion of the Mobius strip from Seminar 10, namely the apologue, again, using the same word, of the ant traversing it. And this ambiguity materializes symptomatically in receptions of the passage. It's a cliché at this point to receive the Mobius strip as a formalization of the rapport of knowledge to truth, per Seminar 12, or a bit more famously, Science and Truth, where knowledge lies on the one side and truth on the other side. Yet where, of course, the surface only having one side, knowledge becomes truth and truth knowledge and so forth. But already by describing the formalization in this manner, as speaking of one side and another, is fallacious in accordance with the most famous apologue about it. Lacan's point is that the ant doesn't know it can complete its traversal, not due to its lacking truth, positively, but because at each point it can only suppose that it lacks truth, positively. If the real of the Mobius strip were to be that truth, if the real of the Mobius strip were to be, that truth is always on the other side of the knowledge. And thus, if one were to pose the lack as symbolic, i.e. as lacking something, then the real would be none other than the imaginary real. On the contrary, the real of the Mobius strip is that, in and of itself, nothing lacks. A much closer approximation of the stakes of truth, i.e. there's no other side, while it is only the supposition of the ant qua symbolic of the other side qua real by necessity of language, ultimately the supposition of knowledge, hence the subject's division between knowledge and truth, that truth is posited as a lack. Now, this digression allows for a discernment of two related methodological structures that are crucial to the comprehension of the symbolic, yet critical in the miscomprehension of the real. That the symbolic lack, on the one hand, is always between, e.g., what makes the agalma by way of the fetish per Seminar 4, and ultimately the subject-object, so to speak, of fantasy per Seminar 6, symbolic, is the veil, shell, curtain, and so forth between one or the other. While what makes the mapping truth/knowledge on the one and the other side of the Mobius strip symbolic is that there is supposedly an edge between them. And on the other hand, that by its very own presupposition, there is a realer, or even truer and more real, lack beyond. The question is whether we attribute this between/beyond to the symbolic, i.e. as its constitutive, possibly necessary illusion, or precisely to the real, i.e. thus falling in this illusion wholeheartedly. Back in 1953, the main reason, logically speaking, for Lacan's return to Freud's logos is for the symbolic order to play the function of the median between the imaginary and the real. But there's a twofold ambiguity about what it means to play the median. On the one hand, it is clear from, say, Lacan's comments on the beginning of Psychoanalysis in Function and Field that it doesn't matter whether the reminiscences of the hysteric are imaginary or real, but that ultimately they are constituted in the symbolic, a register independent from the others. On the other hand, it is clear from the concave mirror experiment in Seminar 1 that the symbolic is not only to be distinguished from the other two registers, but also that it is to distinguish one from the other, to the extent that the imaginary is not the real. Nonetheless, with no further specification about what the imaginary and the real are, it is unclear what the imaginary and what is the real. Note well, I haven't said it is unclear what is imaginary and what is real. On the flip side, the symbolic does mediate between two equal elements, namely the analyst and the analysand, and indeed, Lacan is consistent in calling for a third party in this ménage à deux. Except here, Lacan realizes that if the two elements are equal, i.e. if analysis takes place ego à ego, ego to ego or equals to equals, and ultimately if speech is just to mediate between them, since analysis at this point is supposed to lead to speech as revelatory, then the symbolic as three is rather beyond the imaginary two. The symbolic as beyond is here rectified under the name, importantly, of the absolute other. And it seems from a broad reading, and a close one of the passages in question from Seminar 1 and even Seminar 2, this absolute other is something like the locus of symbolic lack. But nonetheless, there is yet another ambiguity, namely the real, literally as in Seminar 1, Lacan equates the real with the ambiguity of speech, and one could ask, like Leclerc did in the 1950 think conference SIR, what is the real, since Lacan had only talked about the symbolic and the imaginary in spite of its title. And one could respond, like Lacan, that it is, quote, a totality. That sounds like the imaginary, does it not? I'm not being facile here. There is a reason for this logical confusion, and it's not because Lacan doesn't have a theory of the real, as some people claim. He isn't yet the other Lacan of the real, etc. He absolutely does have a theory of the real. It's the so-called backdrop, l'arrière-plan of the symbolic. But simply that the real looks like what is most symbolic, i.e. it's beyond, hence the absolute other. And thus, all in all, transposing the symbolic on the real, it looks like the imaginary, aporia. Now, one could say that it's all because we're dealing with this Lacan rather than the other, or even the other side of Lacan. This Lacan so obsessed with speech and language and the likes, but the truth is that the suppositions here are not at all extraordinary and quite precisely show the presuppositions inherent to the extent that anyone is speaking, and indeed to the aporias thereof. I claim that the manner in which Lacan slowly corrects this is through the growing realization that, on the one hand, if the symbolic is to be distinguished from and to distinguish the imaginary and the real, i.e. to be between the others, then each register is to do the same with the others, the imaginary with the real and the real with the symbolic and the imaginary, lest the other two be conflated. And that, on the other hand, put quite simply, none of the registers are beyond any of the others for the precise methodological reasons. But this process takes its time, and frankly, this methodological backdrop of the development of Lacan's theory is characterized by these suppositions and their rectification. Consider, for example, the way in which Saussure is first exposited in Seminar 3, where the couple, signifier signified, both syncrotic, yet to be distinguished, namely the first is symbolic and the second is imaginary, is mediated by a beyond, effectively, namely that of discourse qua diachronic. So that's the between and the beyond in one. Or another, conversely, the way in which the paternal metaphor is first introduced in Seminar 5, where the between of the couple of priorly equal signifiers is the supposition of the subject. Again, quite literally, and so forth. This is not only the ordinary functioning character of Lacan's process, but in and of itself a kind of important trial and error concerning the suppositions of the symbolic. And thus far, nothing is worth discarding, since even if a claim is misplaced, even if the grand secret of psychoanalysis is that there's no other of the other, this is not to negate that the other of the other is the supposition of the symbolic, i.e., in order that there be speech at all, this absolute other must exist, from Seminar 5, one seminar before. Even if such claims are misplaced, nonetheless they're useful. I should mention, therefore, before going into all of this, that I believe parallel to this is operative the Lacan's increasing registration of lack or negativity, more precisely maybe, i.e. two partitions of negativity on the tripartition of the registers. The first, not obvious but easier to work with, is the triad Verneinung, Verdrängung, Verwerfung, explored largely in Seminar 1 and 3. The second, quite obvious but harder to work with, since it creates a combinatory of registers over three variables, namely agent, object, and lack, is the triad frustration, privation, castration, explored largely in Seminar 4 and to some degree in 6. I can't give a proper, but ultimately, I can't give a proper account of these terms, except insofar as I can. I can't give a proper account of this with regards to all of the basics of logic, the law of the excluded middle, principle of non-contradiction, and so forth, though I have, since one overcomes the history of logic's masking lack by means of mathematical logic, and this remains the best way in which to break the issue down. But nonetheless, I want to point to two related problematics. On the one hand, the real negativity is irreducible to the symbolic to the extent that its presence is precisely imaginary. On the other hand, from the perspective of symbolic lack, this imaginary presence thus equivocates with real negativity, and one could say literally looks like it. Let's take the first case. First, Verwerfung is differentiated from Verdrängung to the extent that what is repressed in the symbolic is a return in the symbolic, an extension of the principle of presence and absence and presence, etc. While, famously, what is foreclosed from the symbolic reappears in the real, but only to the extent that it requires imaginary presence to support it, i.e. it reappears in the real. Second, a Verwerfung very much looks like a Verneinung, even to the point that for Lacan, the French translators of Freud misrendered the text along these lines, according to Seminar 1, projecting a judgment, a definitionally symbolic operation, on foreclosure where precisely this judgment lacks, but knows nothing about it. Ultimately, already in Seminar 1, Lacan refuses that the Wolfman is psychotic, and by the time of Seminar 3, Lacan is preemptive in developing a support for psychosis that is measured against itself, since Schreber is as castrative as anyone else, only through its substitute in the imaginary, Entmannung, or emasculation, rather than against an expectation, fundamentally symbolic or even socio-symbolic, of what it should be. And, even more ultimately in Seminar 10, no surprise, it is as soon as Lacan realizes this knotting of registers around Seminar 10 that Verwerfung becomes the principle, effectively, of fantasy. I would go, and have gone further through L'étourdi, suggesting that it doesn't go without saying, ça ne veut pas sans dire, is not only a foreclosure, for reasons that I can't explicate now but have written about elsewhere, but also, literally, the raison d'être of psychoanalysis, because the whole point is that it doesn't go without saying. In a sense, then, we are talking about the generalized foreclosure without ordinary psychosis. Now, let's take the second case, which I will discuss more historically. The paradox of Seminar 4, you could say, is why Lacan distinguishes the variable lack and the variable object so readily in frustration. Indeed, as one of the issues from the beginning is how the object of frustration being real, nonetheless doesn't imply that the lack in frustration is not imaginary, and yet explains how a real lack, i.e. privation, is a real lack, and is precisely by recourse to the extent that it is circumscribed by a symbolic object. The interesting point is that because privation effectively becomes a rephrasing of male castration for women in Seminar 4, privation equally becomes a substitute for a kind of penis envy, which is criticized by Lacan for itself rendering a real lack imaginary by conflating frustration with privation. Hence, textually, the 2 points made above are there and play an operative role not only in the theory, but also what it theorizes. And indeed, Seminar 6 already helps rectify the issue, since not only is the word privé, private, deprived, or privated, used to describe the process by which man comes inside out, contrafactus, the image of the inverted glove, in the dialectic of castration, but also in accordance with preliminary entries in a new transcendental logic of negation, per Seminar 9, Lacan analyzes the differences in function between negative grammatical particles leading to the formulation that the subject tout court, not just one sex or the other, is not without all three negations, ne et pas sans the phallus. It's no surprise then that Lacan arrives at formulating a lack irreducible to the signifier in Seminar 10 in coincidence with a revision of the definition of privation, since the point is now for him that by contrast, woman lacks nothing, period, but nonetheless she is not full, while man is not full because, by his own very supposition, he lacks some nothing, positivized. Accordingly, I believe we can get a generalized privation without, well, everyone being a woman. Hence, the parallel development of the registers and their respective lacks, each thread with its trials and errors converging toward formalization. But then there's something that strikes me funny, and I wonder if it strikes you funny too. In Seminar 7, in the Fortbildung of das Ding, these suppositions of the symbolic, the between and qua beyond, are directly and indeed literally transposed on the real, or at least the weight of the real as such as it is presentified, direct quote. What if the primordial real suffers the signifier? Indeed, two of the above examples of beyond and between are almost directly recycled from earlier work. In the same fourth lesson of Seminar 7, Lacan calls the thing the absolute other of the subject, what was previously used to describe the reservoir of symbolic negativity, and, on the other hand, he makes quite clear that the thing is precisely what is beyond any equal couple, neither Sache nor Wort, neither good nor bad object, and ultimately hors signifiant and signifié. I mean, in the established edition, it's just hors signifié, but Miller has a note about how he's not sure what it's supposed to be. I think it almost doesn't matter. It's beyond the opposition. In any case, to me, this does reek like a deepening of symbolic negativity beyond its purview, and ultimately a transposition of this negativity on the real. And thus, all in all, it is distinct almost categorically from the other trials and errors, because it slides from the symbolic not to what is a supposition of the real by the symbolic, but rather to what is real, period, thus adopting the supposition of the real by the symbolic and rendering it an imaginary real. In effect, the triad collapses. Put another way, if, quote, this das Ding is not in the relations that cause man to put in question his words as referring to things that they nonetheless have created, much like the other, and Miller's analysis revolves around this equation, and thus, if there is another thing in das Ding, il y a autre chose dans das Ding, I say that this negative, beyond symbolic relations, that is positivized as an other thing, again, has nothing to do with the real to this extent precisely. Finally, if das Ding is at the center, but excluded, and thus is excluded interior, and thus, of course, famously extimate, this is only to the extent that it is symptomatic of the same mistake, constitutive as practical supposition, but convoluted as a theoretical one, with respect to the Mobius strip, a point which I believe is made quite palpable in Seminar 16 with the topological reappearance of the term extimacy. Indeed, Lacan already speaks of the need for another topology in Seminar 7, i.e. a pointless topology, which we often assume incorrectly to be all topology. And yet more symptomatically, if Lacan calls science that thing where the thing is rejected in the proper sense of Verwerfung, and sublimation's elevation of an object to the dignity of das Ding, the privation of something real, I am tempted to say that he flips the order, because the pseudo-real that is foreclosed, das Ding is the pseudo-real that should be foreclosed, of which we are truly privated. In particular, it is absolutely foreclosed or privated that the nothing be. Indeed, that the nothing be, the void with a capital V, is assimilable with, per seminar 16, an absolute real, and ultimately a jouissance supposed by the symbolic as absolute, precisely what is to be really lacking to the extent that there is anything at all. Put another way, the nothing is, the void, is what is implied insofar as not only the one is not, but also the one is not. By contrast, and this is a point only legible through the approach given to the joint of the signifier and the real of seminar 9, but ultimately developed through seminar 16, the foreclosure privation of that the nothing be, to the extent that it is supported by the imaginary, is the condition that the one is not purely and simply. And axiomatically speaking, this foreclosure / privation permitting the non-being of the one is dependent on not the void, but the void set, actually the opposite of the void. Hence the reference to the poem of nature per Badiou in his reading of Heidegger, because nature is what is not founded. So, in effect, when you found sets on the void set, then you get exactly not the void of the poem. So, ultimately, one gets to the conclusion, perhaps surprisingly, that the void and the void set, which seem to be, metaphysically speaking, similar in metaphysics' approach to mathematics, but are actually completely opposite in mathematics' approach to metaphysics. The difference, for example, between a Müllerian-Fregean approach and a Badiousian-Cantorian approach is precisely the one in the final analysis between the void and the void set. Finally, and one might consider this anticlimactic, but I think it puts the thing in motion quite well, the very straightforward consequence of this formalization is that it permits one to conceive of sexuation in particular, the pinnacle of the process of converting from the Mytheme to the Matheme, and indeed the most important place to do so. It's often been noted that Lacan sometimes appears to equate there's no sexual relationship with there's a sexual non-relationship. If Lacan makes use of both, it's because each has a sense. But what's certainly true is there's really no sexual relationship. But seriously, it really is absent. That there is a real lack of the sexual relationship, an invariant and constitutive foreclosure or even privation of it that can't just be transposed or even, one could say, transubstantiated as symbolic lack. And it is only in light of the above that we can pose the question, what is the sexual non-relationship? Not the return of the repressed sexual relationship. It doesn't work that way. But none other than the reappearance of the real of the lack under the guise of the real lack under the guise of the symptom. So to promote the sexual non-relationship is precisely to identify with the symptom, which is worth avoiding. So, in conclusion, I want to emphasize that philosophy and logic with no further specification is ambivalent. It is not necessarily on the right side, even if it's on the right track, and to a certain degree, that is its privilege. But this is just as much a reason to force its hand with mathematics. Hence, we can just about do psychoanalytic philosophy, or better, philosophical psychoanalysis, but I invite you all to join my project of reintroducing the necessity of a formalized approach to philosophy. Thus, I think it's appropriate to tell a joke recounted to me by the great mathematician and to his unknown knowledge a philosopher, Paul Lockhart, to whom I owe my non-professional awakening to mathematics upon hearing my choice to become a philosopher. Perhaps it might be a relatable story, albeit a fictitious truth. A prominent liberal arts school loses a big source of endowment and begins to make choices between related programs, slashing politics in favor of religion, music instead of art, Arabic in favor of Hebrew, etc., until eventually the board is left with mathematics and philosophy. During a meeting with the chairs of the two departments, the chair of mathematics says, "Look, we mathematicians are simple people with small budgets. We only really need a paper, pencil, and maybe a garbage bin." And then the chair of philosophy snaps, "We don't even need the garbage bin." Brilliant and accurate, but nonetheless I'd like to amend the joke on two counts. If only the mathematicians would use the garbage bin less and the philosophers would use the paper and pencil more. Thank you.
Let's open up the Q&A. Any questions? I think I'd like to collect the mic. I can ask a question. introduction. Okay. Oh, thanks, Paris. Excellent stuff. Thank you. I was a bit. I know where you were going, and I sympathize very, very strongly with your project and specifically what you've been presenting. But I was a bit puzzled by the terminology, and I think lacked a clarification which you brought in towards the end of the presentation. That when you said basically, the void is not a void set, right? But that is like a terminological distinction which holds on the basis of a critique of a certain metaphysical void. To cut a long story short, the void of the thing, Seminar 7, and if I get you right, that would be a kind of like imaginarization of the real, right? Mm-hmm. But what is wrong with actually calling ontologically the void set in mathematics just the void, or the nothing is in your previous exposition of the point? That is to say, is there anything wrong with actually conflating, because I don't think there is anything wrong towards working towards a materialist and formalized ontology. I don't think there's anything wrong with conflating the ontological notion of the void with the mathematical notion of the empty set. So I guess the real question would be to say, where do you start from if your aim is developing a psychoanalytically informed but materialistic and formalized ontology? I mean, I don't see a problem with the nothing is being the starting point. Or maybe here I'm more Badiousian than Lacanian, and we discussed that. But I don't think that moving from set theory and its postulation of the empty set as, let's call it, primal existence, to actually making a hardcore ontological claim whereby that is the void, and that's how you start building up a materialistic but formalized ontology. I don't see that as a problem. I know you do, because I think this is your critique of, in dialogue with me and also with Frank, your critique of, that you don't see why ontology needs to be based as a axiomatic ontology on the equation between the empty set and the void. I mean, it's a bit abstruse, but I hope you followed the question.
I mean, of course, on the level of terminology, it's almost pure identification, what we like and what we don't like. But what I will say is that it depends on how, if you buy my opening gambit, which is that, in a sense, to say that the nothing is the big mistake, right? I mean, because, or to say, that's in effect what I'm equating with the void, right? With a capital V. Because there was not enough time to get to this, because I just wanted to draw out of more or less the first 10 seminars, the sort of place that Seminar 7, and then of course less so, but nonetheless by indication Seminar 9 is. But for it to be more direct about it, right? The void set, right, does not have the kind of existence that the void does. The void implies, I think, however you slice it, the in effect positivized existence of something and beyond. But also almost deeper than the symbolic, but fundamentally a symbolic supposition, right? And so to say that the nothing is, well, that's great. That is what the supposition of the symbolic is, of what the real, right? But that has nothing to do with the real, in fact. And do you see? I mean, maybe I'm just hammering in the same point, but the nothing is. I mean, I don't know how else you slice it. We're not taking something that's not. We're taking the nothing as such. But to say that it is to presentify it, right? The weight of the real as such presentified. I mean, it's a perfect
I'm not sure about
phrase.
The last passage precisely, and I think it hinges on, a certain terminological acceptation of what you mean by void. I mean, I see, let's be very simple here. I see the problem as per a 7 or 7 scenario where you basically end up imaginarizing the real, that's thing. And you can do that, and Lacan does that, and it's one of the worst Lacan, in my opinion, by means of the void, right? But this is not to say that when you claim the nothing is, to simplify, the foundation of the symbolic, that is not also absolutely. Mm?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it depends on.
Let me just conclude. I mean, one thing is to say there is a risk with claiming the basic construction block of an ontology is the nothing is, because there's a risk of reifying that, blah, 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 negative theology, a certain understanding of that thing. But it's not necessarily the case that that is the case, because you can also understand, I mean, the nothing is the void qua letter as well. Mm?
But you see, this is maybe...
it's not just like drawing an empty set. I think my problem is like, why do you need like such a final distinction between the void and the empty set? That is my question, basically.
Well, yeah, no, I think I see the root problem, because I don't think the letter is. I mean, in the sense in which we usually, I'm trying to draw out of Lacan, systematically we're talking about what copulation means. To say that something is to say that it is symbolically, in effect. And I think that's almost like what he's doing implicitly is, you don't agree. I mean, he's drawing out implicitly from the history of metaphysics, whenever he reads anything, this point. And so to say that nothing is to say that, or to say that, for example, the letter is to say that the letter is symbolic. Well, no. I mean, in the sense, it's not yet signifying. Right? If we're talking on the level of the unary trait, I mean. You see what I mean? So the nothing is unequivocal for me if you accept that copulation basically equals we're fully in the symbolic. Nothing is symbolic. It's not real. You see, I think that's.
Now it's like a pure simplification that even if you bring in difficult notions such as the unary trait, and this is a simplification, Lacan is saying basically this is what is. You don't need like a signifying system for that. I'm really simplifying here.
Yeah, but the unary trait does not operate according to the logic of symbolic lack, as I was trying to draw it out of the various right? I mean, it doesn't. Otherwise, what would be the point of the distinction? They would just be sort of like proto, but in the very stupid sense, just like not yet signifiers, but destined to be. But that's not, in fact, the point, right? I mean, the point is that they are, as I like to say, autological. They're not a tautology because we don't have copulation yet. But in effect, they're autological because in and of themselves, they are themselves. So it's not actually, it does not obey symbolic lag. The real one is autological because it doesn't have copulation. If the real one had copulation, then it would be imaginary. In fact, it would be the master signifier, right? It would be the imaginary one. I mean, the master signifier is not the imaginary one, but you would be getting to that point, right? So that's why I think one has to be very schematic about it, and to say that what is, in the strong sense of copulation, not in a there is sense, but in it, right? Not in an es gibt sense. That's why I mentioned all that to begin with, because Heidegger tries to get around it, but then he kind of basically says the being is, but the nothing version of that, das nicht, right? But not that there is, but is symbolic. So maybe we can disagree about that, but I don't see any other way to slice it, at least philosophically speaking.
Okay, maybe time for, you started late, so I guess we have time for, yes, we started at like 3:20, so 5 more minutes if there are more questions. Yes, please.
Thanks, Paris. That was quite a tour de force. Since my fixation's on Freud, I wanted to sort of I was hoping you could re-articulate maybe the decision to read a text like Totem as a Matheme rather than a Mytheme. Because it seems either way it founds a logic of exception. But if we reroute it and read it as Matheme, with respect to sexuation, your final point, I guess, like what are the real consequences, whether we say it's a Mytheme or a Matheme, if it found a logic of exception either way? I mean, obviously you do think that there is, but if you could maybe rehearse the argument and maybe with respect to sexuation especially, since it's quite inextricable.
I think that reading between the lines, the argument of Seminar 17, when he first begins to attack this, is basically if you read only the Mytheme of Totem and Taboo, not just women don't exist. It's a masculine sexuated situation by nature, because we're talking about what's all in or what's all in the symbolic, right? I mean, that's what masculine sexuation is. It has a positive exception, which would be the nothing that is beyond the which needs to found, etc. But that's pretty marginal, right? It's not all men. You see the point. So the Mytheme is entirely on the masculine side, right? In that regard, I mean, I'm not even going into the issues of like trying to locate how an origin myth is always a myth about how the signifier enters the real, and so always, therefore, when you use logos, is unable to formalize the relationship between the symbol. Not even going into that, just that's more or less what he says in Seminar 17. Why move from all of these mouths of gold to this, what has he said? Yeah, like bullshit, basically, about, yeah. It's not, the point is not that it's bullshit, the point is that, in effect, it's by nature, it's masculine sexuated, so that's why, yeah.